Welcome to our webinar today, How to Foster a Culture of Innovation and Creativity by Susan Dutton of Smart Relationships. My name is Ryan Kauth and I will be your host today. I direct the Wisconsin Small Business Development Center, or SBDC, at UW Green Bay. The Wisconsin SBDC at UW Green Bay is part of a statewide network supporting entrepreneurs and business owners through no-cost, confidential business advising and targeted educational programs. Regional SBDC experts facilitate improvement and growth for small and emerging mid-sized companies and help launch successful new enterprises. The no-cost business planning advising and low-cost leadership development training at the Wisconsin SBDC at UW Green Bay is funded in part through a cooperative agreement with the U.S. Small Business Administration, or SBA. Our website is uwgb.edu/SBDC. Today we continue our 2015 monthly no-cost 30-minute topical webinar series designed for the success of small business owners and their executive team members. At the conclusion of this webinar, we will share the upcoming webinar topics, and we encourage you to consider registering for those. We thank Mickey and Tim from First Business Bank and Michael Wentworth of TMR Associates for their partnership in developing and promoting these monthly webinars and for their dedication to small business success. There's Michael Wentworth there. We thank him and his company, TMR Associates, the B2B appointment setting company, providing qualified leads and market insights. After the webinar today, you will be emailed a link to a recording of this webinar. During the webinar, you are invited to ask questions at any time. Please use the menu along the right side of your screen indicated here in the red circle. Type your question and hit enter. As soon as I see it, I will make note of it for the presenter to address toward the end of our webinar. And now I'd like to turn it over to our expert presenter this month, Susan Dutton of Smart Relationships. Susan?
Thanks, Ryan. Good to be with everyone to talk about this issue of fostering an innovative and creative culture. How does that happen? Something that's necessary in today's business climate. And I'm going to be answering it with the idea that building a high EQ culture, EQ stands for emotional intelligence, is a direct path to fostering that innovation and creativity. So let's talk about if you show the next slide, kind of statements that we might hear on the job that are frustrating to those in leadership and management. Statements like, that's not my job, or that's above my pay grade, or I don't know if I can handle that, or just flat out, I don't know, without anything behind it that seems to indicate they're going to try to know. Or it might manifest more in actions. Frustrating things can be, when an employee doesn't see things from the customer's point of view, or nobody's bringing creative suggestions to the table. They're just looking to leadership to supply that, or even just only doing what's expected and not being able to think beyond the boundaries of their own responsibilities or their own daily tasks. So is that something that you can relate to, Ryan?
Absolutely. I think everyone can relate to that.
All right, and so the question comes up in our minds, why? Why are people behaving this way? What's the problem? And there could be many different answers to the question, but usually when we don't understand why people are behaving, we kind of supply an answer in our mind. And usually we supply an answer based on what's known as negative interpretation, right? So you don't understand why someone's doing something, and you decide it must be because they're lazy, for example. And that could be correct, but there could be a lot of other factors behind it. Something in that individual's history or belief system. Could be something in the business culture, or there might be frustration, distrust, fears, or worries operating in the background that are leading to that behavior. But if you had to pick just one of those to change, to act as a lever to change those results, which one would you pick?
Well, the only thing that you can actually control there, Susan, is business culture.
That's right. That is the only thing you can actually control. And I would pick that too. And specifically, I would pick setting an intention and a practice of building a high EQ culture. So we'll look at why in these upcoming slides here. But to go back in time a little bit, once upon a time, we thought that people behaved in the marketplace according to this principle of homo economicus, right? That human beings were rational, they made rational decisions, they were operating in markets with perfect information, and they were pursuing effectiveness. And but the reality that we see every day can be substantially different. So, for example, if you think about what happens in shopping outlets on Black Friday, or you think about how there's a whole science of setting up a retail store to promote these impulse purchases, right? Making people feel like, I have to have that. Or what about investment decisions? As a matter of fact, in 2002, the Nobel Prize winner in economics was not an economist. It was a psychologist named Daniel Kahneman. And he won the prize for integrating insights from psychological research into the economic science, and especially concerning human judgment and decision-making under uncertainty. And in the studies that led to the Nobel, he explored the decisions for people to buy and sell on the stock market. And he found out that when stock prices are rising, people are less inclined to look at risk, and they focus on performance. But when stock prices are falling, it's just the opposite way. They give priority to safety. And so the result is that people buy high and sell low. And that is not actually a rational or an optimal outcome. And in fact, when stock prices are falling, they tend to run to bonds, which are perceived to be safe, but they have very, very low rates of return. So here's a situation where there's tons and tons of rational data available, but you can see that these optimal decisions aren't being made, and they're clearly not being made entirely on rational grounds. So all this is to say that for years in business, we've kind of looked at the world the way we would like it to be. We would like it if people acted logically. We would like it if people acted rationally. But the reality is there's a lot more than that going on. And in fact, it's kind of irrational to pretend that it's otherwise. So people have two sides to them. And if we don't put the two sides together, we won't be able to understand the actions and reactions of people that are working for us or our customers. So moving to the next slide, bottom line is that people are driven by emotion, and your performance as a business is driven by people. And as a manager, you have to look at that other side. Right? There's actually two jobs that leaders, or two divisions of leadership responsibility that people have to consider. So one is that there's a rational side, and that side is involved in things like planning, defining goals, analyzing, creating outcomes, implementing projects. Those are important things, right?
Absolutely.
And yet, yeah, but a lot of times it's that is looked at as the only responsibility, and this other side, the side of managing people, is sort of an afterthought. And yet, how much time does a manager spend managing misunderstandings, trying to create team atmosphere, changing problematic behaviors, etc.? I mean, when you think about job responsibility in terms of the way time is used, what would you say that split is, Ryan?
It's probably a lot more on the EQ side than it is the rational side, right?
Probably, because it doesn't take that long to do the rational stuff, and the rest of it is there in that people side. And you know, again, if we don't pay attention to that people side, it's easy for us to conclude that, you know, people are just strange, right? Some people are just weird. Who can understand their behavior? But and so then we've convinced ourselves that it's difficult to understand this side, and it's difficult to manage people. But in reality, to understand people, we just have to add the emotional to the rational analysis, right? So our behaviors are influenced not only by what we think, but what we feel on an emotional basis. So when we're talking about this innovation and creativity, you know, which side of those two things are reflected in these types of innovation, out-of-the-box thinking, doing more than is expected, delighting customers, and which side does that come from?
Sounds a lot like EQ to me. I think I'm repeating myself a lot, Susan.
Yeah, it's that EQ side. And, you know, when you think about this whole idea of rational versus emotional, a good metaphor is the idea of photography, right? Black and white photography versus color photography. Now, when color photography was first developed, people thought it would put an end to black and white, but it hasn't, because they each have their strengths. So black and white photography is used when something timeless, you know, needs to happen, and it's used when you want to accentuate light and shadow, and it brings out facial expressions because it reduces distraction. And it really helps bring attention to the subject of the photograph. And so, you know, it's like in business leadership, rational thinking is good for when there are right and wrong answers and there are hard measurements, and you don't want to have distractions coming in. On the other side, color photography is used when story is important, when you're trying to create a mood and a feel and provide a rich experience to the viewer. And in fact, this is what Harvard Business School now thinks is the new competitive competency that is required, is to be able to do that soft side, able to create that mood and that feeling and that rich experience for customers. And so that's what the EQ side is, not only a way of managing internally, but it's increasingly being seen as necessary to compete in a global marketplace. So let's also talk about what is the cost of not having emotional intelligence in your workplace. Do you have any idea, Ryan, what the #1 reason people leave companies is?
They don't want to work for that individual anymore.
Yes, that's right. The #1 reason for employee turnover is a poor relationship with your supervisor. And so if you look at the cost of turnover, how much does it cost to replace every person who goes out the door? At the lowest levels of salary, 30K and below a year, about 16% of annual salary. So for an employee making $10 an hour, that's $3,300 that it will cost you to replace them. But at the senior most levels, it's 213% of annual salary. So if you have a VP or senior exec that's making $100,000, it's $230,000 to replace them. And if you think about that cost compared to the cost of one leadership profile and debrief at $189, you can see that there's a tremendous ROI to just paying attention to measuring and promoting that EQ side of things. And let's take a look at a sample profile to understand a little bit more about how these things play out. So this is a profile of a young business leader, and this is a go-getter. And I don't have time to explain what every category really means in this brief presentation. But let's take a look at these bars. Overall, you can see that some bars are really high. They're up there in the skilled or expert range. So goals, optimism, motivation are high, as well as consequential thinking. So this is a portrait of a young go-getter who is not only motivated and driven, but he's able to think through the best moves to reach those goals. And yet, this department is underperforming. He's not able to get the results, even though he seems to be really motivated and committed. So what's low on this graph?
Looks like emotions, empathy, soft skills.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so what's happening is, even though he's driven and motivated, and he's not an actively obnoxious type person, he's leaving people behind, right? He's also leaving himself behind. So this is a picture of somebody who really has bought into this is business, it's not personal, feelings don't have any place in business. And it's been working for him as an individual contributor to be a go-getter and to put his own emotions on the shelf. And because he has that habit with himself, he also is unable to connect to others on that channel. So now you put him into leadership, and suddenly he starts to fail. Why? He doesn't know how to bring anyone with him. And so all of that soft side of that relationship is missing, and he can't build a cohesive team. So he's not necessarily trusted. And the people underneath him are feeling kind of used. They're feeling burned out by his constant enthusiasm without his ability to hook them in and bring them along. And he's struggling. So this is a perfect picture of why you want to try to get your hands around measuring some kind of objective measurement of what EQ really is among your leaders and your teams. And in fact, we'll talk through some steps here on this slide. How can you foster then innovation and creativity? How does that work with EQ? And one thing I want to say about it is innovation and creativity are natural properties of teams when there are no barriers. In other words, they're not something that has to be built from the ground up. They're more things that have to be allowed to flourish by removing blocks to them. And blocks come in whenever you have people that are motivated more by these fears and these worries and this distrust, some of those factors we talked about early on. Those factors are present when the EQ side of the leadership is low. And so innovation and creativity are stifled. So in order to change that, to create an atmosphere where they can flourish, well, in business, right, you get what you measure. You get what you measure. So let's say that a company says that they have a goal of customer satisfaction. That's their number one goal. We want to delight our customers. But what they actually measure is sales on a month-to-month basis. Is our revenue growing? How successful do you think that company is going to be at delighting customers, Ryan?
If they're looking at just sales, they're probably going to be missing a few things.
They probably are, right? And as a matter of fact, the more often they repeat that focus on sales, the more likely they are to encourage behavior on the part of their sales staff that doesn't put customer delight first. So it's really important to measure what it is that you're trying to achieve. So same thing with EQ. Measuring it as a baseline and then measuring it as you go on in the process of enhancing it are important things. It's also important to set explicit goals around it. I think people are really used to seeing the latest sort of management thinking idea come and go, or they're used to very short-term types of exercises like DISC profiles. We all take our DISC and we have kind of an aha, like, oh, this person is just different from me. It's equally valid way of being. It's just different than me. Those are good things. But so having a high EQ culture is something that has to rise to the level of a top-line goal. In other words, one of those key strategies, whether it's a sales type of goal or a new market to enter into, a high EQ culture raises to that level, and it has to be made explicit for people to take it seriously, because people need time to change. They need time to learn and change. And if it's just an assessment that's used and then it goes away again, then the change is not going to have time to happen. Another important thing is that for leadership to set the example of personally growing in emotional intelligence and being sort of upfront and honest and transparent about it, in order to create a climate of permission to discuss it. And that's another great thing about having a goal like this, is it actually sets up the framework and the permission to discuss subjective behavior. So you're able to have conversations about how a certain type of behavior either does or doesn't display emotional intelligence, and you're also able to have those deeper discussions about what's motivating that behavior. So backing it up with action, setting the personal example, is also important in creating that climate in which innovation and creativity can flourish. But if I had to pick just one of the competencies to develop to really help people become more innovative and creative in their thinking, I would focus on that competency of exercise optimism, one of the 8 that we looked at briefly in the chart. And optimism in EQ terms is not this idea of, is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? You know, that's what we usually think of with optimism. But really, optimism in EQ terms is about possibility thinking. It's not about saying the glass is half full. It's about saying the glass could be totally full, and here are 10 ways that could happen. Okay? People really get stuck in their thinking when they have only 2 choices. You can hear it when you listen to people. You know, for example, and that employee who's stuck in a difficult relationship with their supervisor, they think, I can put up with it or I can quit. Do you hear only 2 choices in that?
Sure.
So we want them to move beyond this just A or B. And one way that leaders can encourage that is to say, and what's another option? And what's another option? And when you first start trying to encourage that, a lot of times maybe you'll get this kind of blank reaction, like, I don't know. And sometimes I'll throw out silly examples, you know. What's another way you could handle the conflict with this person? People go blank, and I'll say, well, you could punch them in the face, right? You know, and they look at me and laugh nervously. I'm not really suggesting that, but what are possibilities? And sometimes just helping people think outside the box, you know, just asking enough questions to get their mind engaged and to generate possibility C, D, E, F, and G, so they can get unstuck and become more innovative and creative. I think another important aspect is just praising and rewarding specific examples of innovation and creativity in the moment. Or this is an example of like customer service, but Zappos shoes had just a person on the phone taking calls, and someone called in to return a pair of shoes, and the woman said it was because she had bought the shoes for her husband and her husband had died. And that employee, without even asking permission, because she knew the culture of her company, pulled out her corporate credit card and ordered flowers to be delivered to this lady, you know, with a note from Zappos, sorry for your loss. And that was praised and rewarded in some very specific ways. They told that story. They told that story within the company. They told that story to customers. And so you better believe they're going to get more of it. You know, other employees will hear that, realize the permission they have. It's a way of reinforcing and underlining the corporate culture they're wanting to create. And so you can do the same thing with innovation and creativity. When you notice an innovative or creative idea, to just take that moment and say, wow, that was some really creative, out-of-the-box thinking. And then tell that story to other people, and you'll get more of it. There's also one thing that is really critical not to do, and that is use blame. Blame is the biggest killer of innovation and creativity that there ever was. because it focuses on what went wrong and who caused it to go wrong. But the problem is, once you identify that, you still have to decide what it is that you're going to do differently in the future or how you're going to fix the issue. But in the meantime, you've created an atmosphere where people are going to have those fears and worries. And when they have those fears and worries and they don't feel free to take risks, they don't feel free to make mistakes, you will absolutely kill innovation and creativity. So really, really important to create a climate that doesn't blame people, but instead focuses on what's the solution, how do we fix it, and to understand that there is no human system that is error-free. You know, the same thing that allows us to be innovative and creative also allows us to make mistakes. So if you create a climate in which no mistakes can be made, you're also going to create a climate in which no risks will be taken and you won't get what you're looking for. The last thing you can do is you can actually use EQ assessment as a recruiting tool. The Air Force actually did this. They had a big problem with turnover among their recruiters. They had 50% turnover every year, and it cost them $30,000 to train every new recruiter. So you can imagine what an expensive problem that was.
That's expensive.
And it's very expensive. And so what they began doing is they began assessing incoming recruiters for EQ and looking to see who succeeded and why. And they were able to build a model of the EQ competencies that led to a successful recruiter. And once they were able to identify it, they also trained all their incumbents on those skills, and then they started hiring based on those skills. And in 1 year, they took their turnover rate from 50% to 4%.
Wow, that's something. Yeah.
Huge
Exactly.
impact. So those are some ways that our listeners can help foster a culture of innovation and creativity. So were there questions?
Yeah, actually one came through just about, actually probably came through from that Air Force, but example, did the Air Force or other organizations that assess their job applicants for EQ, did they take a profile essentially of their most successful person in that position and then try to match? Is that essentially some of the strategy behind it?
Well, in the case of the Air Force, actually they started by just assessing all the incoming recruiters and waiting to see which ones were the 50% that stayed,
okay,
that didn't fail somehow. And then they said, okay, what did these people have in common? Because, you know, the incumbents, the ones that had been there for a long time, they had a lot of knowledge built up, a lot, you know. So they wanted to see, for people just coming in with no knowledge, no training of, you know, of the job, who made it and why.
gotcha. Thank you, Susan. And if anyone else has any other questions for Susan, you can certainly email her at this email address or this phone number, and her website at smartrelationships.org is a good resource as well. So, Susan, thank you very much for sharing that information. Extremely valuable. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Our next webinar, which is next month in April, features Kevin Donnelly of Aurora Healthcare. He will present how to develop and profit from a culture of wellness. In May, Spence Smith of Spencer X. Smith Consulting will present how to establish yourself as an expert. Then in June, we'll learn how to hire leaders who have it all. And in July, how to focus on your customers to grow your business. You can register for our on-site workshops, online certificate programs, and all upcoming no-cost webinars at uwgb.edu/SBDC. We also have several past webinar recordings there on sales, marketing, business ownership, and leadership. So in closing, I would very much again like to thank Susan Dutton of Smart Relationships. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Mickey and Tim at First Business Bank, and Michael Wentworth of TMR Associates. And thank you all for attending. Now, go foster a culture of innovation and creativity. This concludes our webinar. Goodbye.